Of all the celestial bodies, none is more enigmatic than the moon. It drifts across the night sky, ever-changing yet constant, a silent watcher, timeless and mysterious. Today the moon plays a rather passive role in the background of our lives. In prehistoric times, however, this couldn't be further from the truth. In this video, I'll explore the ancient roots of humanity's connection to the cosmos, drawing on history, mythology, and philosophy. In order to keep this video at a reasonable length, we'll primarily focus on the moon. I'll also be weaving these historical and symbolic ideas into broader frameworks of human consciousness, most notably the work of Jean Gebser. And with that, let's begin. The significance of ancient humans' relationship to the sky cannot be overstated. Since the very birth of human awareness itself, the night sky represented the highest order, the manifestation of the sacred in its fullest glory. Quote, "Simple contemplation of the celestial vault already provokes a religious experience. The sky shows itself to be infinite, transcendent. Transcendence is revealed by simple awareness of infinite height. Most High spontaneously becomes an attribute of divinity. There dwell the gods. There a few privileged mortals make their way by rites of ascent. There, in the conception of certain religions, mount the souls of the dead." There's good reason to believe that the moon likely provided the first intimations for humanity's eventual ascent into space. Setting the sun aside, the moon is the most obvious and clearly visible celestial object in the night sky. Its predictable waning and waxing rhythms from fullness to invisibility certainly wouldn't have gone unnoticed. Since the earliest times, it's likely that it functioned as the first means of measuring the passage of time. The very word month, which more or less comprises one lunar cycle, has its etymological root in the word moon. To trace it even further back, not only the words month and moon, but also mother, measure, matter, and man are all derived from the Sanskrit root ma. Quote, "Where the moon was for early man the measure of time, matter is for present-day man the measure of space." If the moon was our first clock, it follows that early humans would have sought ways to track its rhythm. As a matter of fact, several obscure artifacts have been uncovered in recent decades that, according to some scholars, suggest that humans could have been tracking the phases of the moon as early as 40,000 years ago. The most compelling example is the Blanchard bone. Discovered in a cave belonging to the Aurignacian culture of the Upper Paleolithic some 30,000 years ago, this carved segment of a reindeer bone features a series of curious notations. The first scholar to conduct a rigorous study on this bone was Alexander Marshak. In 1972, he published his findings, and through microscopic analysis, he claimed that the notches weren't carved all at once with the same tool. Rather, they were carved in sets. After reconstructing the notches in question, Marshak found that there were striking correlations here to the changing phases of the moon. Another example is the Lebombo bone, discovered at Border Cave in South Africa. Carved out of a baboon's fibula, this piece is believed to be roughly 43,000 years old, according to 24 separate radiocarbon datings. Notched into a single row are 29 distinct marks, making the correspondence to the 29.5-day lunar cycle quite convincing. Lastly is the Ishango bone. Believed to be approximately 20,000 years old, Marshak speculated that this bone might represent the numeric notation of a 6-month lunar calendar. Among the three, this one is the most contested, and personally I would agree. As several archaeoastronomers have noted, however, it's unlikely that archaic humans would have pinpointed the precise timing of the full cycle. Because the moon is only visible at night, the new moon phase would have been obscured for a night or two each month. Now we have to bear in mind that Marshak's interpretation of these artifacts remains controversial. Alternative explanations range from meaningless decorations to mathematical tools. However, if the Lebombo and Blanchard bones actually are the first lunar calendars, then naturally the next question would be, why would ancient humans be concerned with tracking the moon? Was it simply for practical and survival purposes? Or was there a deeper, more intuitive and emergent sense of some greater cosmic order? To properly explore this question, we first have to contextualize both the state of the world and the state of human consciousness from which these artifacts came. 30 to 40,000 years ago places us deep into the Upper Paleolithic era, a time so far removed from the world we inhabit today that it is virtually another world. The Ice Age gripped much of the planet. Ice sheets covered most of northern Europe. Vast regions of fertile grasslands and tundras occupied much of what is today harsh deserts. Sea levels were significantly lower as well, opening up various different land bridges, islands, and extending coastlines into areas now fully submerged. Massive megafauna roamed the earth. Woolly mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, thunderbirds, and many other creatures of near mythical character. Our Homo sapiens ancestors weren't the only human species here either. During this time, they coexisted with 4 or possibly 5 different human species. Neanderthals and Denisovans are the most well-known, the latter only being discovered in 2010. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, isolated groups like Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis, both tiny, hobbit-like humans, roamed the islands. Genetic evidence has likewise suggested that there are as yet undiscovered human species that interbred with West African populations. I say all this to paint a picture of the magical, mythical world that influenced the evolution of humankind. In this world, one can easily imagine scenes reminiscent of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. An untamed world where multiple human species, each with a brain structure comparable to ours, coexisted in a landscape both brutal and mystical. In this prehistoric Middle-earth, we can imagine these inhabitants, warriors and hunters, sorcerers and magicians, being cloaked in various textiles and garments, establishing some form of early trading networks, and potentially capable of riding horses. In order to better understand how Paleolithic humans might have perceived the moon, we can turn to Jean Gebser's concept of the magical consciousness structure, as put forward in his work, The Ever-Present Origin. At once a linguist, philosopher, poet, and cultural analyst, in the 1940s, Jean Gebser proposed that human consciousness is in transition. He conceptualized 5 major structures of consciousness that humanity has transitioned through. Each preceding structure becomes deficient and remains dormant within us, hence the term origin is ever present. One of the primary differences between each structure is a fundamental change in our perception of time and space. The magical structure of human consciousness could broadly be defined as a time before the division of the human self and other, before the separation of mind from nature. Consciousness was immersed in the rhythms of nature, and reality was experienced as a fluid, interconnected whole. Humans didn't think abstractly about the world, but rather participated in it directly. Magical awareness is not yet an individual ego or soul, but rather a tribal or collective soul. What distinguishes this from the previous, archaic structure is the emergent feeling of not only being in the world, but of having the world. For the first time, man attempts to free himself from his fusion with the primeval forest. The emergent sense of needing to cope with the forces of nature gives rise to the likes of sorcery, magic, and ritual art, the very root of shamanism. Indeed, many shamanic rituals would have taken place under a new or full moon. And in the same way that the moon journeys through states of death and rebirth, so the shaman journeyed between the earthly and celestial realms. In the earliest of times, the moon would have been experienced as an active presence, a living entity, along with all the other celestial spheres. This participatory connection between the macrocosm and the microcosm, between cosmos and psyche, would likely have been intuited very early on through the simple awareness of the moon. The moon has long been associated with cycles of birth, death, and rebirth, symbolized by its continual waxing and waning between invisibility and fullness. It is no coincidence that the average female menstrual cycle closely mirrors the lunar cycle. both following a rhythm of roughly 28 or 29 days. Across cultures, this synchronicity has long tied the moon to fertility, femininity, and the cycles of life and death. Throughout the Neolithic and into the Middle to Late Bronze Age, moon goddesses with these qualities could be found across the world, and Gebser draws the connection between these goddesses and their agricultural counterparts. Quote, "In a world of temporicity, the moon is a determinant of the growth of grain crops. Seen from the mythical view, the grain can only ripen according to the progression of moons. Not until the mental structure's observation is maturation tied to daylight and the sun, hence the traditional and irreconcilable antithesis, either moon goddess or grain goddess. Antithetical from the mental standpoint, from the mythical, the moon and grain are correspondences." On a similar note, there's an interesting but lesser-known fact behind the meaning of Father Time, Kronos, and the Grim Reaper, the personification of death, relating to the yielding of the scythe. At a surface level, the significance of the scythe would seem to only represent the harvesting and reaping of the life-giving crops. However, this symbol is rendered much more potent when we realize it is the sickle of the crescent moon. One of the moon's most tangible effects on the Earth is its gravitational pull, which shapes the rhythm of the tides. The oceanic depths have long symbolized the unconscious. The lunar ebb and flow of the tides thus mirrors the ebb and flow of the unconscious world of dreams, insights, and emotions. And unlike the sun, the moon does not produce its own light, it merely reflects the light of the sun. The moon is gentle and mild, emitting a diffuse, reflective light, as opposed to the sun's bright, linear light. From these basic observations, we can see just how the lunar archetype came to be one of feminine, intuitive, reflective, and emotional qualities. Now, let's take a step back and consider everything we've discussed. Based on the evidence of Paleolithic lunar calendars, with a bit of creative world building, framing it within the magical structure of consciousness, we've attempted to step inside the minds of prehistoric humans to imagine how these Paleolithic shamans, warriors, men, women, and children would have experienced the moon as a living, rhythmic presence. The tracking of lunar cycles likely would have had the most practical use for women. If this connection between lunar and menstrual cycles was known in the deepest recesses of prehistory, then it's not surprising why the majority of moon deities across cultures are lunar goddesses, most commonly associated with fertility, motherhood, water, and similar lunar principles. This brings us to a crucial question. Were Paleolithic shamans the first astrologers? Did their direct, participatory experience with the cosmos, through ritual, trance, and divination, plant the seeds for what would later become astrology in Babylon and Greece? This question is rarely explored. Nearly all historical discussions of astrology begin in Mesopotamia or Hellenistic Greece, as if it had emerged fully formed. But could its roots stretch back much further, deep into the Paleolithic mind? If you're familiar with my channel, you might recall my video on Hamlet's Mill. In this book, authors Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschen put forward the case that many of the mythologies of the world seem to encode astronomical information. They suppose that the oral transmission of myth enabled prehistoric knowledge to be passed down through the millennia, and over the course of their investigation, came to the conclusion that some unknown prehistoric people had a highly sophisticated understanding of the cosmos. On this lost knowledge, they say, quote, "This is the original form of astrology, which is both vaster and less defined than the later, classic form which Ptolemy set forth. Even as the cosmos is one, so cosmography is made up of inextricably intertwined data. To say that events on Earth reflect those in heaven is a misleading simplification to begin with. In Aristotelian language, form is said to be metaphysically prior to matter, but both go together." In other words, they suggest that the original astrology wasn't just a system of predictions, but something deeply embedded in the structure of reality itself, something both felt and lived before it was formalized into signs and charts. Could part of this forgotten knowledge have been the first astrology? And was this form of astrology, at its very root, instigated by the presence of the moon? Anyone who has studied astrology beyond the casual mention of sun signs and newspaper horoscopes will know that it is a staggeringly intricate system. Many astrologers will attest that even a full lifetime of study on a single planetary archetype will not grant them a full understanding of it. Given its complexity, astrology must have emerged gradually, with roots stretching back deep into the fog of prehistory, born from a state of magical consciousness. In essence, I'm speculating that the astrology of the Greeks and Babylonians, rather than being entirely their own invention, was more of an expanding on, a first articulating of, or a mythologizing of the memory of a much older system, an archaic way of thinking. A system that was partially formed, perhaps, over the millennia, rooted in shamanism and magical awareness. In Gebser's framework, this shift from an experiential, magical astrology to a mythical and codified system seems to mirror the evolution of consciousness itself. What began as a direct participation in the rhythms of the sky slowly gave way to the myths and complex symbolism of the mythical structure, where gods and goddesses became the rulers of the heavenly spheres. As Gebser observed, in magic and mythical man, a different kind of knowledge is at work. He does not know something, it knows him. Of course, we can never truly know how prehistoric peoples experienced the moon. That is the mystery of prehistory. It was a time before our awareness of time. Nonetheless, in piecing together the fragments left behind, cave paintings, bone plaques, and other artifacts, with theories on the evolution of consciousness like that of Jean Gebser, we can use our imagination to have a surprisingly vivid recollection of the way it might have been. For the vast majority of human history, the moon was not a dead rock in space. It was the great timekeeper, the celestial mother, governing and illuminating the unconscious world of intuition and dreams. Thanks for watching. As always, stay curious. Peace.